A line was drawn today by the Supreme Court, and the real question is who just lost the ability to step beyond it? That question sits quietly at the heart of this moment, not because of anything sensational on television and not because voices were raised, but because moments ago the Supreme Court of the United States did what it does when it wants to leave no doubt. It said no calmly, firmly, and without any space for reinterpretation. When that happens, something changes. Not on the surface where headlines compete for attention, but underneath where power is actually shaped and constrained. This wasn't a ruling designed to humiliate anyone. Courts don't work that way. It was a decision that quietly shut a door. And when the Supreme Court closes a door, it almost never reopens it. What makes this moment both unsettling and significant is how little drama surrounded it. No harsh language, no public scolding, just a legal conclusion that drained an argument of its strength, and in doing so, placed a boundary on power that had long been taken for granted. Donald Trump sits at the center of this, but this isn't about personality. And it isn't about politics as spectacle. It's about authority encountering its limit, about what happens when the highest court in the country decides that a claim of power extends too far, not emotionally, but constitutionally. Stay with me here, especially those watching from the United States and those joining from the United Kingdom and Canada, because moments like this are easy to misread. They don't feel explosive, they don't seem urgent at first glance, but these are the moments that quietly redefine how power functions going. If you value calm explanation over noise, if you care about understanding what courts actually do when they speak this way, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who still believes the rule of law matters, and subscribe so we can keep having these conversations together. I don't ask that lightly. For those who've lived long enough to watch institutions face stress tests before, recognizing these signals is part of staying steady, because here's what most people will overlook. The Supreme Court didn't simply turn down an argument today, it dismissed an entire way of thinking about power. And when that happens, the consequences don't arrive in a single moment. They emerge gradually, deliberately, and with effects that last. So before turning to politics, before focusing on headlines, it's necessary to understand what this ruling actually means in legal terms, why it landed the way it did, and why over time it may prove far more significant than it seems right now. What sets this ruling apart isn't only the result, it's the path the court took to reach it. The Supreme Court didn't debate, it didn't bargain, and it didn't signal doubt. It simply declined to accept a claim of authority that had long been treated as flexible, as though it could expand when pushed. That distinction matters because courts don't set out to humiliate people. They dismantle ideas. And the idea rejected here wasn't minor, wasn't technical, and wasn't accidental. It was the belief that power could be stretched beyond constitutional limits if applied forcefully enough, loudly enough, or repeatedly enough. This is where many misunderstand how the Supreme Court truly communicates. When the justices are divided, you can hear it. When they're uncertain, it shows up in cautious wording and narrow logic. But when the court believes a boundary has been crossed, the language sharpens, options narrow, the tone shifts from persuasion to correction. I've seen rulings like this before, not often, but often enough to recognize the signal. It's the difference between a setback you can maneuver around and one that stays with you, one that reshapes how future arguments are viewed before they're ever presented. Here's the part that's easy to overlook amid the rush to respond. This wasn't the court saying, "You lost." It was the court saying, "This method does not belong here." In legal terms, that is a far heavier statement. It tells lower courts what not to consider. It signals to future litigants where not to tread, and it makes clear to anyone paying attention that the boundary has been reinforced. For those who have lived long enough to watch institutions tested before, this moment feels familiar, not alarming, but clarifying. It's the law reminding power that it operates within a structure it did not create and cannot reshape on its own. That's why the reaction among legal scholars has been so pronounced. They recognize that when the Supreme Court closes a door this decisively, it isn't responding to a single dispute. It's defining the terrain for everything that follows, which brings us to the question that comes next. What exactly was the court unwilling to accept? And why does that refusal matter far beyond this one decision? At the heart of this ruling wasn't a personal judgment, it was a rejection. The court was asked to embrace a particular understanding of power, that authority could be exercised more broadly, more flexibly, and with fewer limits than the Constitution has traditionally allowed. And the court said no, that refusal is the real story. Because the Supreme Court didn't just say this argument fails in this case, it said this argument does not fit within the structure of the law. That distinction matters more than it sounds. A failed argument can be revised, reshaped, and brought back again. A rejected framework rarely gets a second invitation. What was really under examination here was the notion that certain actions could be protected simply by office, by timing, or by an asserted sense of necessity. Courts encounter arguments like that all the time. In rare and tightly limited situations, they even accept them. But this time, the court made something unmistakably clear. The boundary itself mattered more than any justification offered for crossing it. For anyone who has dealt with contracts, property lines, or long-standing agreements, this instinctively makes sense. You don't get to rewrite the rules after the fact just because following them has become inconvenient. Either the terms hold or the entire system starts to wobble. What the court did here was quietly drive the marker back into the ground, this far and no further, not because of who was asking, but because of what was being asked. That's how constitutional limits are preserved. Not loudly, not emotionally, but firmly and without apology. I've watched cases where parties assumed the court would bend because the stakes felt too high for it not to. And when it didn't, the realization didn't arrive as outrage, it arrived as recalculation. Because once a court makes it clear that a certain claim of authority won't even be considered, every future decision has to adjust around that reality. That's why legal scholars reacted so quickly to this ruling. They understood the court wasn't merely settling a dispute, it was sharpening a boundary that had been allowed to blur. And when boundaries are clarified at this level, they don't stay confined to one case. They ripple outward, shaping how power is exercised, how it's challenged, and how it's restrained from this point forward. That's the part most headlines will miss. The ruling wasn't dramatic, but it was conclusive. And once the Supreme Court defines what power cannot do, the entire conversation shifts. The question is no longer how far authority can stretch. It's how that authority will function within limits that have now been unmistakably reaffirmed. What gave this moment such weight within legal circles wasn't only what the court decided, it was how it decided it. Not every Supreme Court ruling speaks with the same force. Some leave doors ajar, some hedge, some quietly invite another attempt with better phrasing. This one did none of that. The Supreme Court of the United States chose language that was disciplined, narrow, and final in tone. No invitation to return later. No hint that a slightly revised argument might succeed. Just a clean refusal to adopt a claim of authority the court found incompatible with the constitutional framework. And this is where people often misunderstand what humiliation means in legal terms. Courts don't embarrass individuals with sharp words. They do it through omission, by declining to engage, by refusing to legitimize an argument, by writing as though a claim simply doesn't belong in the discussion at all. In legal terms, that's devastating because once the Supreme Court treats an argument this way, everyone downstream takes note. Lower courts adjust. Lawyers recalibrate. Future cases change course before they're even brought. I've seen this pattern before. An argument doesn't just lose, it loses standing. Judges stop testing it. Attorneys stop building around it. Not because it's controversial, but because it's been effectively labeled incompatible with the legal framework itself. That's why legal experts reacted so quickly to this decision. They recognized this wasn't a narrow defeat or a close call. It was a structural loss, the kind that quietly limits what power can even ask for next time, the kind that follows into future cases long after the headlines disappear. And this is where the court's message becomes unmistakable, not outrage, not condemnation, limitation, a reminder that the Constitution is not elastic and that authority does not grow simply by insisting that it should. When the court writes this way, it isn't bargaining with power, it's containing it. And once containment begins at this level, the effects don't end with a single ruling. They shape what comes next, how arguments are framed, and how much room power is given to move from this point forward. This is where many people assume the story ends and where the law quietly says it doesn't, because the most consequential effects of a Supreme Court defeat don't appear right away. They surface later in what can no longer be argued. This is the moment that separates a temporary setback from a lasting constraint. When the court rejects an argument this cleanly, it doesn't just resolve today's case, it reshapes tomorrow's options. From here on, every lawyer considering a similar claim has to pause. Every judge reviewing a related issue has to factor in what the court just said and what it deliberately chose not to say. This is how power begins to narrow, not abruptly, but incrementally. I've watched this pattern play out over time. At first, nothing seems different. The same faces remain. The same confidence is projected. But behind the scenes, strategies shift. Arguments soften. Claims that once sounded bold are suddenly framed more cautiously or abandoned altogether. Because once the Supreme Court draws a line, lower courts don't cross it lightly. And here's the part that rarely gets explained. This kind of defeat follows a person into every future courtroom, not as a punishment, but as a reference point. Judges remember, clerks remember, the record remembers. So the next time authority is asserted, it's measured against what the court has already rejected. That's why this moment matters more tomorrow than it does today. And that's why legal experts reacted so strongly. They understand that power doesn't vanish after a ruling, but it does lose room to maneuver. This is the quiet consequence most people miss. The ruling doesn't shout, it doesn't threaten, it simply reduces the space in which power can operate. And once that space begins to shrink, every step forward becomes more careful, more scrutinized, and far less certain. Which brings us to that the people who tend to grasp this instinctively, often before anyone else does. Those of you who've lived a little longer recognize what's happening more quickly because you've seen it before. Not in this case, but in life. You understand the difference between noise and consequence, between a dramatic moment and a structural shift. For seniors in particular, power isn't an abstract concept. It shows up in tangible ways in whether property rights are respected, in whether benefits are honored, in whether courts remain places of stability or turn into places of pressure. That's why moments like this land differently for people who've spent decades depending on systems to function quietly, predictably, and fairly. When the Supreme Court limits authority this clearly, it sends a signal that reaches far beyond one person or one case. It says the rules still apply even when it's uncomfortable, even when the stakes are high, even when the spotlight is intense. If you've ever waited months for a court decision that affected your home, your finances, or your family, you already understand the value of this without being told. You weren't seeking drama. You were seeking steadiness. Courts exist for exactly that reason, not to reward emotion, not to validate power, but to slow things down when pressure builds. And that's why this ruling matters so much to people who may never step inside that courtroom. It's not about who won or lost today. It's about whether the guard rails still hold. Because once courts begin to bend under pressure, everyone feels it eventually, especially those who depend on consistency more than influence. Quiet as it may have seemed, this moment was a test of institutional steadiness, and the court's response was measured by design, not hurried, not theatrical, deliberate that leads to the longer view, the part of this story that stretches well beyond today's decision. Seen through that lens, the constitutional stakes come fully into focus. Supreme Court rulings aren't written for a single news cycle or a single political season. They're written to endure, to guide behavior long after the headlines disappear. That's why this ruling wasn't framed around punishment, it was framed around prevention. The court wasn't looking backward, it was looking forward. It was asking a quiet but powerful question. If this claim of authority is accepted today, what does it permit tomorrow? This is how constitutional law actually functions. It anticipates repetition. It guards against gradual expansion. It draws lines early so they don't have to be redrawn in moments of crisis later. Those who remember earlier periods when institutions were under strain will recognize this instinct immediately. Courts intervene not only when things are broken, but when they see a pattern forming that could break them if left unchecked. That's why restraint matters so much at this level. The Constitution doesn't protect democracy by reacting loudly. It protects it by setting limits before power persuades itself those limits no longer apply. And when the Supreme Court reinforces a boundary this clearly, it isn't speaking to just one individual. It's addressing every future office holder, every future administration, every future moment when authority is tempted to stretch. That's the long game here, not embarrassment, not political fallout, but a reminder written into precedent that power in this system is borrowed, not owned. For seniors especially, this kind of constitutional restraint feels familiar. It echoes lessons learned over time that strong systems endure because they know when to say no, not because they say yes too freely. This ruling did exactly that, and while its effects won't be immediate, they will shape how authority is exercised, challenged, and contained for years ahead. Which brings us back to the present and to why this moment stood out so sharply to those who understand how courts speak when they intend to be remembered. The reaction from legal experts wasn't outrage, it was recognition. They understood something right away. The court didn't merely close a door, it removed the hallway leading to it. In law, there's a critical difference between losing narrowly and losing structurally. A narrow loss leaves room, another argument, another court, another moment. A structural loss does not. And this was structural. The Supreme Court left no room for reinterpretation. It offered no workaround. It gave no hint that the same claim might succeed under slightly different circumstances. Instead, it drew a firm line. This cannot be done. That matters enormously going forward, because once the court acts this way, every future assertion of authority is measured against this ruling first, not emotionally, not politically, legally. This is why power feels the impact here, even if nothing appears different on the surface. Future filings become more cautious. Future arguments are framed more narrowly. Judges lower down the chain, grow less patient with claims that echo what the Supreme Court has already rejected. An argument that once seemed bold suddenly feels risky. A strategy that once inspired confidence becomes defensive, not because anyone was shamed, but because the terrain itself has shifted. And here's what most people don't see. Supreme Court defeats don't end conversations. They redirect them often into far smaller spaces. That's exactly what happened here. Power didn't vanish, but it lost flexibility. It lost leverage. It lost the benefit of the doubt. From this point on, every move is made with this ruling in mind. That's why this moment landed so hard legally, even though it appeared calm on the surface, and why the real consequences won't show up in today's headlines, but in the boundaries that quietly shape everything that comes next. There's a moment in stories like this when the law stops feeling distant and starts feeling human, not because the rules themselves change, but because the pressure reveals something real. Courtrooms have a way of doing that. They strip away performance, they remove the noise. And what's left is how power behaves when it's told quietly but unmistakably that it has limits. I've always thought of courts as mirrors, not moral ones, but structural ones. They don't ask who someone claims to be. They reflect who someone is when the rules apply evenly, when the record is permanent, and when there's nowhere left to argue around the edges. That's why moments like this linger, not because they decide everything, but because they reveal something essential. They show how authority responds when it's constrained, how it recalibrates or resists. Even after years spent around courtrooms, moments like this still stay with me. I remember watching a judge once, just after a major ruling had been issued. There was no reaction in the room, no commentary, just a quiet sense that the balance had shifted. Later, that judge said something almost as an aside. Now we see how this will be handled. That stayed with me because that's what courts are always observing. Not just compliance, but adaptation. For those watching who have lived through periods when institutions were tested, when rules mattered more than personalities, this probably feels familiar. It's not the loud clashes that stick in memory. It's the subtle shifts, the quiet changes, the moments when you realize things will never work quite the same way again. This ruling fits that pattern. It didn't proclaim a new era. It didn't demand attention. It simply reminded power that it operates within a structure, not above it. And when that reminder comes from the highest court in the land, it doesn't fade quickly. It settles in. Which brings us to the final question. What does this moment ultimately leave behind? And why does it matter? Even in its quietness, it carries significance far beyond what most people immediately perceive. When the dust settles and the headlines move on, this is what remains. Not outrage, not celebration. The record, carefully written, patiently reviewed, governed by rules designed to endure moments exactly like this one. Courts don't rush to conclusions, and they don't yield easily to pressure. That isn't a flaw, it's the safeguard. Accountability in law is rarely loud. It unfolds gradually through reasoning, through precedent, through decisions that don't seek approval because they don't need it. For those watching from the United States and for those joining from the United Kingdom and Canada, this is why moments like this matter. Not because every ruling signals a crisis, but because understanding how the law actually responds allows us to separate substance from spectacle. It reminds us that even when power pushes, the system still knows how to push back quietly and with discipline. If you value conversations like this, calm, careful, and grounded in how courts actually operate, I hope you'll stay with us. Take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes the rule of law still matters, and subscribe so we can keep making sense of these moments together. I don't ask that lightly because these conversations aren't meant to inflame. They're meant to steady, to help us recognize the difference between passing noise and decisions that endure. As this story continues, remember this. The most consequential actions in court are often the least visible. A line drawn without drama, an argument rejected without insult, a boundary reinforced without apology. Those are the moments that shape what comes next, long after the cameras are gone. And if you'd like to continue this conversation, another video is waiting on the left side of your screen. It's part of the same effort to stay informed, stay grounded, and understand how the law preserves stability even when power resists it. Stay curious, stay steady.